Florida and Louisiana, which are the two. Texas comes in number 3. Do not, you'll notice, have a population estimate for our state. So the green in this map, if we zoom in a little bit, represents the range of alligators throughout the Southeast. The red outline outlines the 10, what we call Alligator Management Unit 1 counties. Those are the counties where we receive the most concern from the public about alligators. It's a place that the locations where we do the most management of alligators throughout their range. Now, I can't tell where everybody is on the call today, but the yellow star represents where the museum is in Wake County. So not in alligator range, but not too far from it. So they occur as far inland as the Sand Hills, which is kind of where I like to call it this elbow here in the middle of the state, and also as far north as the Albemarle Peninsula up there. That little cluster of counties at the just above Pamlico River, Hyde, Dare, and Turtle, and that is the northernmost population of alligators in the world. They occur in fresh to brackish water. They're in swamps, rivers, lakes, and ponds. However, they are much more patchily distributed and occur in lower densities than they do in states farther south. And there again, that is because we are at the very northern extent of their range. One of the biggest limiting factors for them is, they can't withstand very cold temperatures. So that's why they don't occur in Virginia, for example. So this is a diagram of seasonal activity patterns of alligators in our state. The yellow here can be a little bit misleading because although they don't actually start mating until around this time, adults will begin moving around a lot on the landscape more than any other time of the year and actually congregating with other adults as early as April, and bellowing is sometimes reported as early as March. So this dark gray area on this annual seasonal activity pattern, what they're doing this time of year is what we call brumating. It's very similar to hibernation, but they don't go into a true deep sleep. If there's a nice sunny day, they will come out and bask and then go back into their hole afterwards. So as I mentioned, the mating season in North Carolina occurs from May to June. A group of alligators, adult alligators, is called a congregation. Now, both the bulls, which are the males, and the females, which we call cows, both of those bellow to advertise to the other alligators that they're available. And so, however, the males are the only ones that produce this sub-audible vibration right before the actual part of the bellow that you hear. And this causes what people refer to as the water dance. So you can find these really cool videos online of them doing this. If it would be difficult to actually see this in person, there's some really fantastic ones, some in slow motion with classical music playing in the background. That's kind of a neat thing to look up. In addition to that difference between males and females, some researchers in a zoo setting who had alligators of known size that had exact measurements of the animals that were making the calls, they were able to take some recordings and in analyzing the sound waves, be able to tell that there's a piece within the sound wave called a formant, and that the length of that formant is actually a true indicator of the size of the animal. And so essentially what they're doing is they're advertising to each other and saying, I'm a male and I'm 10 feet, or I'm a female and I'm 8 feet, that sort of thing. So it's pretty cool. So the nesting season occurs from mid-June to about mid-September. However, most of that activity takes place in July and August. The incubation period is about 65 days. Now, the female, what she's going to do is she's going to build this giant nest. I call it like a big bird nest. It's a great big nest with a cavity in the middle, and she will lay all of her eggs in that cavity at one time. And then she will scrape up all that material. She'll pull up live stems. She'll also rake up dead things, but she'll cover those eggs up, and then she maintains that for the next 2 months. And so she doesn't actually sit on the eggs like a bird. She actually, the nest, as that nest material decomposes, the heat that it puts off is very similar to a compost pile. And that is actually what incubates those eggs down inside of the nest. Now she is going to lay an average of about 35 eggs. They have seen nests with as many as 70, but the average is about 35. Most females don't nest in back-to-back years. They can. However, it's more common for them to only nest every 2 or 3 years. Very similar to sea turtles, but actually the exact opposite. They exhibit what we call temperature-dependent sex determination. So when she lays the eggs, the sex of the embryo inside those little eggs is not actually determined yet. It's only about the middle third of that incubation period. The very low temperatures, the lower temperatures are going to produce females, and the higher temperatures produce males. Now they do, very high temperatures actually will again produce females, but there's also really high mortality at that end of the spectrum. So we typically say that the lower temperatures produce females and the higher temperatures produce males, which is the exact opposite of sea turtles, who also have temperature-dependent sex determination as well. Now, unlike most other reptiles, female alligators are really great moms. Not only is she going to hang around after she lays those eggs and guard the nest throughout the incubation period, once they start hatching, they're going to start calling out, and it's kind of similar to wood ducks, where one of them will start calling and then the rest will call, and she'll hear that, and she'll come to the nest, actually help break open the nest. She'll use her claws like rakes and her bottom jaw like a shovel, and actually excavate them from this nest. She may carry some of them to the water in her mouth. If there are eggs that haven't hatched yet, she can, even though she has a very powerful jaw, she is going to very gently roll these unhatched eggs around in her mouth to help liberate these unhatched young. And then once they once the hatching is complete, they actually will stay in a group that we call a pod, and they'll stay in her territory for the next couple of years. And although they hatch out and they're able to feed themselves, they're going to be eating insects, bugs, all those types of things right to start with. They will call out if they feel threatened, and the maternal female will come to defend them from things that want to eat them. So like I mentioned, when they're first hatch out, they're eating little things like insects, and the bigger they get, the more they graduate to bigger and faster prey, like little fish and frogs and crayfish and the like. And then, of course, once they get to be adults, they can eat even bigger things. They eat all the things that you see here on this list. I think one of the most interesting ones in the list is sharks. So a paper came out a few years ago that described not only where the researchers had observed alligators feeding on sharks, but sharks feeding on alligators. And so even though they don't have the salt secreting glands like crocodiles do, they can spend a large amount of time in these more brackish areas, these saltier areas, because there's a lot of food resources that are available there. So when you think about all the different things they eat, it might, you might be tempted to see this cartoon and think, oh, that's pretty accurate. They eat all those things. Well, they do, but they have very low metabolism. So Adult alligators only really need to eat about once a week during the growing season. All right, so now I want to kind of transition into talking about some of the ecological benefits of alligators. I get this question a lot. Well, what good's an alligator anyways? Why do we want them around? Well, one of the most well-known benefits of alligators is that they dig what we call gator holes. Sometimes you'll hear people call them wallows, that sort of thing. But these gator holes that they dig can be really important pockets of refugia for other wetland species when there's a drought. So think about this nice wetland here. We got, other reptiles and amphibians and fish that depend on it. If there's a drought, then they have to go somewhere else or they're not going to make it. But if you have that same wetland and a gator moves in and, really changes the way that wetland area looks, they dig out that nice hole there. When you have a drought, there's still going to be some water left for the other critters that are there. Also, as an apex predator, they can have what we call a keystone effect on the ecosystems that they inhabit. And so a keystone species, we call it that because their function in the ecosystem is much like the keystone in the top of an arch. Without that top stone, the whole thing would look very different. So as an apex predator, they play a really important role by helping maintain balance in the ecosystem. They prey on these, what we call mesopredators, which really just means middle predators. So the guys in the middle of the food chain that eat the things down towards the bottom. So they keep them from depleting the populations of the things down towards the bottom of the food chain. So as I mentioned, sometimes this can actually have a keystone effect on a whole ecosystem. And one of the best examples of this is a salt marsh ecosystem. So again, a saltier, higher salinity ecosystem in which we don't typically think about alligators being in, but they do use them quite a bit, especially the larger alligators, because they can withstand longer periods of being in saltier environments. It's kind of like us, we can go to the beach, but we can't drink the salt water. We can swim all day, but you got to come back and get a drink. It's very similar for them. And there's a lot of things that they are attracted to those areas. For example, the blue crabs. So the role that this keystone effect, the role that they play in this particular ecosystem is that they, by feeding on these blue crabs, they can actually keep them from eating too many of these mussels that are facilitators for the Spartina cordgrass at the base of that ecosystem in particular. And so by that token, if the alligator wasn't around to put pressure on the blue crabs, then the whole ecosystem would look very different.
So the alligators in that ecosystem actually help boost the cleanliness of the water quality in a way?
Sure. If there's more mussels around and other vegetation to filter the water, then that makes sense to me.
Maybe someone should do some research on that.
Oh, there's all kinds of alligator research that needs to be done. I like the way you think. So I also like to joke and say that alligators get hired as baby bird bodyguards, which is not really what's going on here, but it kind of is. So scientists have basically done some experimental projects in which, so they made some casts of these alligators, these big fake rubber alligators, and they put them out in different places. In particular, they put some in places that they didn't have any evidence of these colonial nesting birds using. So when I say colonial nest, I mean birds that nest in big colonies. So long-legged wading birds like herons and egrets and things. What they found was that these birds were they were seeking out places that had alligators. And, your first question is why? Why would they do that? Well, alligators can't climb trees, but there are certainly other critters that can and would love to get up there and eat the bird eggs. And they are deterred from doing so if the alligator's around for obvious reasons, right? However, alligators have actually had a lot of time in these environments to learn new ways to capitalize on the situation. They have observed alligators, like this one, laying in the water with a few choice sticks on their face. This during that period when the parent birds are still building the nest and they're trying to find that just right twig. They might get lucky and one come down and try to take one of those twigs, and then they've got lunch. So crocodilians are actually the only known reptile that uses tools to lure their prey like this. And the reason I say crocodilians and not just alligators is they've also observed mugger crocodiles doing this as well. So that's pretty fascinating.
So I've heard and seen pictures of, I think, plover birds cleaning the teeth of crocodiles somewhere in the world. Is there anything like that occurs with our alligators?
I don't think so. Not with alligators. I haven't seen it anyways. But I know exactly what
our alligators just
birds.
eat the birds, huh? They haven't learned that trick yet.
Definitely. Oh. But so even though they end up as apex predators as adults, they actually start out at the other end of the food chain. So you see these little gators here actually have some arrows going from them to the other direction, where some of these mesopredators also like to have the little guys for lunch. In fact, it's estimated based on populations in other states where they've done lots of research on these things, they estimate that 80% of those hatchlings aren't going to survive that first 2 years. And it could be even longer here in North Carolina. And I'll kind of come back around to that. But a lot of people are surprised to hear that. A lot of people don't think of alligators getting eaten by other things. And so one of the questions I get most often is, well, what on earth wants to eat an alligator? Anything. Anything that is bigger than it, that can get a hold of it, they hatch out. They're not too smart yet. They're not too quick. And so they can be an easy meal for just about anything from mammals. Those same raccoons that are scared of the adult alligators will definitely dig up a nest, eat the eggs, eat the hatchlings after they hatch out. Bears. And of course, birds like great blue herons. It would be cool if somebody did some research to try and quantify, what critters eat the most juvenile alligators. I have had local residents that have had nests in their backyard. I came to do some surveys, and they told me, they said, you're probably not going to see any little ones today because the great blue herons have been eating them like potato chips. So people do observe this happening quite often.
Wow,
Snakes,
I wonder if the
bullfrogs.
birds or the alligators are getting a better deal there. It seems like they're pretty much in balance.
Yeah. Bullfrogs, large fish like bass, and yeah, even big alligators. I don't know if they've really tried to quantify how often alligators eat each other for food, or if it's more often that they're killing younger alligators for territorial reasons. But I would be willing to bet that they do a little bit of both for sure. So I kind of touched on this a little bit a while ago. takes considerably longer for our juveniles to outgrow that vulnerability to predation here at the northern extent of their range, and that's because they grow so much slower. So because they're reptiles, once those temperatures drop below 60 degrees, they can't metabolize the food anymore. And so during the wintertime, alligators go into a den and they don't eat throughout the winter. Now, farther south, take Florida or Louisiana, their alligators may be able to eat all year round. There may only be a very short period of time in which the alligators don't eat in those places. Also, reproductive maturity has nothing to do with how old an alligator is. It's completely related to size. So males and females are both reproductively mature at 6 foot. And in South Carolina, a 35-year market recapture data set, out of all the data that they collected over 35 years, they only had a couple of records of females that were smaller than 7 foot that actually nested. So even though they're capable of reproducing, they may still not reproduce until they're 7 foot. Whether or not that has to do with latitude, with how far they are north, or if it's a density dependent thing, that remains to be seen. But it could be that our alligators may not reproduce until they're about 7 foot as well. I have personally not observed any females yet smaller than 7 foot that had nested. So in Louisiana and Florida, which I always use those as an example because they're the further extreme, it may take their alligators average of 10 years to reach reproductive maturity. Whereas here, our females in particular, we expect that it could take them as long as 2 decades before they're old enough to start contributing to the population. So we think about that, and we in particular think about the species that we're more used to. For example, deer. Deer can reproduce at 18 months. And female bears can reproduce at 3.5 years. So there's a really big difference there. It's really difficult to compare population growth rates of alligators to mammal species for this reason. And we really need to think of it more in terms of some of our longer lived fish species, or maybe even think about it as, comparing them to things that live long and aren't harvested for many years, like trees, for example.
Did you say earlier that only 20% of the eggs made it to breeding age or breeding size?
No, that's 20% only survive that first 2 years.
Wow, that's incredible.
So, and you said eggs, so that's a really good point. The female can lay, like I said, on average 35 eggs, but not all 35 of them are going to hatch. And it's variable from one nest to the next, but if the hatch rate is only 80% of that, and then in addition to that, 80% of those are that hatch out don't survive those first 2 years, you have a much smaller number. And then those individuals still have to make it another 18 years before they're actually contributing back to the population again.
That seems like an unusual combination of a long maturity time and a low survival rate. I can't think of really any other animals that combine those.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's you kind of hit the nail on the head there for why we do have concerns about in particular losing adult females from the population. It'd take a really long time to be replaced by other females potentially. Question I get asked a lot: are alligators going to benefit from climate change? Or if it's going to be warmer, isn't that good for alligators? And the answer is really a little bit more complicated than that. So this is a temperature graph from 2018, from the winter of 2018, a few years ago. And a lot of you will probably recall that we had record-breaking low temperatures. We had over a week where it got down below freezing, and I think it was a 100-year record that it broke at the time. Well, unfortunately, like I said, that is a limiting factor for alligators. They can only withstand short periods of really cold temperatures. And in South Carolina, several dozen alligators were reported dead later that month. And they think that it's probably directly related to this extreme weather event.
Actually, could you go back to that graph real quick and explain a little more what's going on? There's a lot going on there, and I'm trying to decipher. I see the normal temperature range is that yellowish tan band.
Yes. Yeah, and this here, can you see my mouse on the screen?
Yes, we can see your mouse.
That this is what I was talking about. This stretch here was that several days, it was over a week that the temperatures were below freezing. But you'll also notice there's a lot of really high temperatures going on here too. And this is really kind of what we see on a more day-to-day basis. This is what climate change looks like. It's not just a little bit warmer every day. And a big part of the reason for that is this instability of the jet stream. You know, we have a much weaker jet stream because we have the ice melting at the poles, and so there's not as an extreme difference between the cold in the farther north latitudes and the much warmer to keep a really strong, stable jet stream. And so we get a lot of dips in the jet stream there, and you can see where, you know, it can dip down like this, and we can have these extreme cold events, even though we generally tend to think of climate change as just being warmer. These kind of extreme weather events can actually be really bad for alligators.
So it's a lot more complicated than alligators will just be all over the place up here. It could be detrimental to them.
Yes, there are also other symptoms that could adversely affect alligator populations. So think about sea level rise. The adults can withstand long periods in salty, brackish waters, whereas the juveniles can't. And if you have sea level rise happening, it could wipe out some of the nests. The nests can't be underwater, that the embryos will actually drown inside of the eggs. And I just mentioned, you know, saltwater intrusion, that whole places that are very good for nursery areas for juveniles now, if we have a lot of saltwater intrusion occur in those areas, it could be uninhabitable for the little guys. Also, these extreme weather events that kind of is also loosely tied to the that wavy jet stream effect. You know, we have more catastrophic hurricanes, more that are stalling out and just kind of sitting as opposed to moving on. If you think about it, hurricane season overlaps with the end of when those young hatch out and when they're the most vulnerable. And so that's going to be late August, early September, a very common time over the next couple months for us to get hurricanes now. Can also dramatically alter the prey base. They saw this back in 2005 in Louisiana. They had 2 Cat 5 hurricanes hit them back to back in the same year, and they saw significant changes in the alligator population. Thankfully, their populations are much more resilient, and they were able to bounce back pretty quickly. But it was a big deal, and so really it kind of changes the question. The question more becomes, could some of these negative impacts of climate change outweigh any potential benefits? The biggest challenge from my perspective and in my opinion is the lack of funding that's available for research and population monitoring. So a lot of folks may be familiar with the Wildlife Restoration Act, also known as the Pittman-Robertson Act of 1937. This was a very successful piece of legislation. About a federal excise tax is placed on guns, ammunition, archery equipment, and all that money gets put into a pot that is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And they actually distribute those funds to the state wildlife agencies, who can then use those funds for hunter education and shooting ranges, as well as to restore, conserve, manage, and enhance wild birds and mammals in their habitat. It's a big part of the reason why we were able to restore a lot of wildlife populations that were depleted or even completely extirpated in some instances. It's why we have wild turkeys. It's why we have deer. It's why we have bears. A big part of the reason that those stories were so successful anyways. But what do you see that's wrong with that?
I mean, it looks like it's dependent on how many guns and ammunition or the interest in hunting in an area, right?
Well, that actually has remained pretty stable, or even kind of increased, especially as people have had an interest in target shooting and things like that in more recent years. So it's not
Marcel in the
necessarily
chat
always
said
tied to.
there's no reptiles mentioned.
Exactly, yeah. By definition, we cannot use these funds on alligators because they're reptiles. And so all of the reptile and amphibian work that our agency does is funded by what we call SWIG fund. It's a state wildlife grant. By comparison, it only accounts for about 1.5% of our entire budget. And it's used for all of our species of greatest conservation need. That's all reptiles and amphibians, many of which we know are in need of conservation attention. So think about bog turtles and hellbenders, gopher frogs, all these critters that we know need our attention. And so in my mind, every dollar that we spend on alligators out of this pot, we don't have it to spend on these other species. And also aquatic invertebrates like mussels. All of the work that gets done on all of that comes from that very small capped pot of money. So if anybody's interested in donating, by the way, there are a few different ways to donate to not only alligator work, but all of those species of greatest conservation need. One of the most popular ones is this license plate that was recently redone. It used to have a cardinal on it. Now it has this really good looking pines, barrens, tree frog. And for every plate that's sold, if you get one on your car, you're essentially donating $20 a year to the Non-Game and Endangered Species Wildlife Fund. And it supports all the work that's done by the Wildlife Diversity Program. In addition to that, you can just donate directly. We have a Wildlife Diversity Endowment Fund. And so how that will be used is all donations that go in there, we only use the interest from that money. And so it's there in perpetuity, and we'll continue giving back to the program. I also have had more than one occasion where I've had folks ask, well, how can I contribute directly to the alligator program? I had somebody ask me once, how could they wanted to purchase a GPS transmitter for us to use, which is, that's great. But there was no way for them to be able to donate in that way at the time. And so I did some asking around. And what we found was that we have, there is a nonprofit organization called the Wildlife and Outdoor Recreation Foundation. They're kind of like our Friends of group. I think there's a Friends of the Museum group, for example, that will accept donations on the museum's behalf. And that's kind of how this nonprofit works. They accept donations on our behalf, and they're able to have it earmarked for different things. And so that's really the best way to do that, would be to go through the Wildlife and Outdoor Recreation Foundation. There's also a lot of other great causes on there that are tied to things that our agency does that are also worthy of donations as well. So I'm not going to go into any more about biology and all of that. But if you're interested in reading more about it, learning more about alligators, there's a whole lot of stuff on our website. If you just go to ncwildlife.org/alligator, there's a lot of great information there. And you can always email us at alligators@ncwildlife.org. So I'm going to pause here. This is halfway through my presentation before I go into the next part. See if anybody has any questions about any of that.
Yeah, we do. Glenn was thinking about the temperature-dependent sex selection, and he was wondering if climate change would have any effect on the population demographics, male versus female, and what that change might be.
That's a really good question. I think that what we typically see is that in the nest, there's more of a gradient. You know, you have a cooler spots in there and warmer spots. And so most nests tend to be a mix of male and female, just based on where they are in the nest, whether they're higher up or farther down. And I personally haven't seen any really skewed numbers as far as, we definitely catch more males, but that also probably has to do, at least in part, with the difference in behavior between males and females. So females are a little bit more shy, a little less likely to be okay with a human seeing them. And so if we're driving along looking for alligators, they're more likely to go under and hide and go up under a bush, and we'd never even know they were there, compared to males. But as far as I can tell so far, we haven't seen any skews that couldn't be explained by behavioral differences. That is a good question, and something that I'm hoping will, just through continued monitoring, be able to tell if that becomes the case.
And earlier, Marcel was wondering what kind of sharks do alligators eat? Because there was that one really cool picture of a shark on its way down.
Yeah, I don't know. That looked like don't start me lying. I don't know shark species, but there was a paper that was published a couple years ago about it, and I'm sure that they named the actual shark species.
Yeah, probably whatever shark of the right size and that was in the right place, because I know I've definitely seen them like in the Cape Fear River, and so I can definitely see there being some intermingling there.
Definitely.
Let's see, other questions. I was wondering, how does the historical range of the American alligator differ from the current range? You know, have they always been in North Carolina? Did they used to be more prevalent?
The little bit of data we actually do have a few records that go as far back as the 1800s, but there's not a whole lot, and it was really mostly opportunistic. So if someone in a certain area was interested in recording observations versus, places where they weren't being recorded, and also that type of data is more indicative of where people and alligators interact, as opposed to being a true survey of presence and absence of alligators. I would say that, they still exist in most of the places that we have historical data. I don't think there's anywhere that we're aware of anyways that alligators used to be here, but they've been extirpated, that sort of thing.
Very cool. So they seem to be able to stick around.
Yes. Very resilient.
All right. Well, I'll keep collecting questions during the second half if you want to go ahead. And
okay, great. And the second half is not as long either. So in this section, I wanted to talk more about what our agency is doing to learn more about alligators. Before I go into what we are doing, I think it's important to put it into context of what has been done. So back in 1983, when alligators were still listed, and there are typically additional funds available for endangered species that there aren't for non-listed species, 4 graduate students at NC State did various projects related to alligator biology and ecology, as one big project through the zoology program. And the final paper for that, all the field work was done in the late 70s, but the final report was completed in 1983. In 2011, Dr. Steve Dinklager from Framingham University in Massachusetts has been coming down a few times a year and doing mark recapture work with the animals up on the Albemarle Peninsula and that northernmost population. An NC State student reran all of the Spotlight Survey routes in 2012 and 2013 that were originally run by one of those 4 graduate students back in the late 70s. And then we ran our own Spotlight Survey back in 2017 in Brunswick and Columbus counties. And that's it. That's all of the historical stuff that's been done. You notice there's a huge gap there where we were not collecting any data on our populations. And really that mostly has to do with, like I said, the lack of funding and the need to prioritize those funds for other species. However, in 2017, we started a couple of long-term projects, and we have several other projects that have been picked up along the way. So one of the biggest things we've done is we decided that every time we get our hands on an alligator for any reason, whether it's nuisance, needs to be relocated, any reason, it needs to be marked, and it's a missed opportunity if we don't collect data from those animals. So we initiated this alligator data collection protocol, and it applies to every single alligator that's handled in our state for any reason. So that includes alligators that are handled by our staff, so wildlife management or enforcement most typically, as well as external folks that have to get an endangered species permit from us to be able to handle alligators. So that includes alligator control agents, jurisdictional alligator handlers. These are 2 new programs that are launching this year to assist us with some of our nuisance response needs, as well as researchers. So any researcher that's doing work with alligators that involves capture, they're required to meet all the requirements of this protocol. So we pit tag them for that stands for passive integrated transponder. It's basically the same microchip that your vet will put in your cat or your dog. We also mark them externally by cutting scutes, and then we save those as tissue samples. We can use that for genetic studies. And another thing that we weren't even planning on, we may end up using them for heavy metals testing and other contaminants as well.
And a scute is the specialized scale on top of the alligator for those of...
Yes. So along the tail, there's 2 rows of scutes that stand up taller than the other skin. And there's 2 rows that come together about halfway down the tail, and then it forms another single row. And so researchers historically have been able to use that to their advantage. They're able to use that single row as a 1s row, and then the other 2 are 10s and 100s. So they can use that to individually mark up to 999 animals by just simply cutting the right scoots that coordinate with a certain number. We don't individually number animals that way, but we are able to look at it and tell what year it was first captured and what watershed as well. And they all get the pit tag, so we can scan them and tell exactly look that number up and tell exactly which animal that is. Every alligator is sexed, and we also record the date and time of capture and release, as well as the GPS coordinates of those locations. You may be wondering, how on earth are we able to do that, and why do we do that? That seems like a lot of work, and it is. It is a lot of work, and we're only able to accomplish this by providing a lot of hands-on training for the folks that handle nuisance alligators in our state. So with the exception of 2020, due to COVID, we've been going down to Lake Waccamaw twice a year since the fall of 2016. And each time we go down, we have about 20 people that catch as many alligators as they can for 3 or 4 days. And as a result, 171 people have been able to get training on how to collect these data correctly and how to safely handle an alligator. So we're not just out there having fun catching alligators. This is a long-term population study of the alligators that live at Lake Waccamaw, and we're building a really robust data set that will eventually be used to estimate how many alligators live there, what proportion of juveniles versus subadults versus adults. Is the population stable? Is it growing? And if so, at what rate? How fast are individuals growing in different age classes at Lake Waccamaw? These data are going to tell us a lot about the population of alligators in our state. So as of the end of last year, 47 of the 230 animals that have been marked there have been caught 2 or more times. One particular has been caught 5 times. But every single time that we recapture an animal, we're learning about growth rates and survival and all that good stuff. But wait, there's more. Local residents tell us time and again how our capture work has a really observable effect on the behavior of the alligators that lasts a while after we're gone. So our actions reinforce their natural fear of people. And after we go down there and chase gators for a few days, they spend less time on the human side of the canal and more time on the back side. They're just more wary of people in general and more likely to bolt in the water if someone approaches than they were before we came. So in this way, our work there really has been helping to prevent conflicts between people and alligators in that local population. So we talked about how we're able to accomplish tagging every handled alligator, but I did want to talk a little bit more about the why. Why is this management priority, and what can we learn from doing this work? So number one, we have a need just to monitor relocation activities. We've been relocating alligators for many, many years. That's been our preferred management tool over euthanasia because of our concerns about what removing some of these adults can do to the population. This also helps us evaluate relocation as a management tool. And as I've mentioned, there is a lack of data available on alligator biology and populations in our state. So what are we learning? What can we learn from just marking them? First of all, we know now how many are being relocated each year. Where are they being taken to and from? What's the big picture look like? We're learning also how often we're handling the same individuals multiple times. And with that information, hopefully over time we can start to see some patterns. We may be able to tell, when is relocation successful? Is it, this certain size class between, males and females? Is there a certain release site that works better than others? Is there a minimum distance that tends to work? That sort of thing. And also just basic biology stuff that, we're not getting population level information, but there's still some really valuable information coming from the data that we're collecting. So we have a minimum number of reproductive age females that are out there. As I said, every time we recapture one, we're learning about growth rates and survival rates. And all of that is really valuable information. So by the end of 2021, a total of 800 alligators have been captured, marked, and released in our state since 2017. When the recapture numbers are added in, that's 962 separate capture events in the last 5 years. And you'll notice here that the orange represents nuisance response, and that actually has stayed pretty stable over time.
It also looks like they're unlikely to be recaptured if they were a nuisance. It seems like maybe they're learning.
I think over time, just having more animals tagged in the populations means it's more likely we're going to come into contact with another one that's been tagged before. But it is pretty unusual to catch one more than twice. We have, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. But I think they're also learning from these events as well. It's a good reminder to them, to fear people, basically. So in addition to live alligators, data are also collected from alligators that are found dead or euthanized under this protocol. The majority of the alligator mortality events in the past 5 years were either poached, hit by motor vehicles, or died from some other indirect human cause, such as drowning in a commercial underwater pump, that sort of thing. All of the orange euthanization records are instances in which animals are suffering from severe injuries, like a motor vehicle strike, or ones that were captured and confiscated illegal pets that cannot be released into wild populations. Sometimes we're able to permanently home them in captivity, but there's usually, that's not always an option, unfortunately. But we're still trying to learn about the gators even after they've died. So whenever possible, we send fresh specimens off to have tested for various environmental contaminants and diseases. And our field staff have also been collecting femur bones from every dead alligator. And so the growth rings will be counted under a microscope, kind of like bear teeth or fish otoliths, to attempt to determine how old these alligators were and how their growth patterns actually compare to alligators that live farther south. So that'll be really interesting. I also currently have 2 telemetry projects in which we're using GPS tracking technology. We're learning more about movements of relocated alligators to assist us in evaluating relocation as a management tool, and also locating high quality nesting habitat on some of our state-owned lands in our state. So this is what that transmitter looks like. It just sits on top of the animal. The transmitter itself does, but the cables that we attach them with do have to be surgically implanted in a location. You can see on the back of the neck here where it's much more likely to get a signal to the satellite to be able to transmit those points. So just by pit tagging individuals, we're able to get this type of information. So we can see this animal was first caught in May of 2017 down here and relocated. And then 3 months later, it got in trouble again. And that second time it was relocated much further away instead of taking it back to the same release site. And by the next year, look how close it was to where it actually originally started out at.
Looks like that alligator traveled probably 200 miles, right? It's a long way.
Right, yes. We haven't had our hands on it since then, so maybe he's learned his lesson, staying out of trouble. Who knows? But what we don't know by looking with just this information is well, what kind of path did it take to get from here to here? Was it how many non-gatory places did it have to go through to get there? How often does it encounter roads and other obstacles, other challenges? So having the GPS transmitters on some of them helps us learn more about that information.
And do you have any data?
The first one.
Do you have any data about why that particular alligator was relocated? What kind of trouble it was getting into? Marcel was wondering.
I don't know off the top of my head. In most cases, alligators tend to be relocated due to, them being in places where it's potentially a risk to people and pets. And unfortunately, a lot of times, it's the result of bad human behavior. We can see evidence of people feeding them and, to get that animal out of that situation sometimes. I don't know about this one in particular. So this was the first one that we put a transmitter on back in 2018. We tracked him for close to a year before he lost his transmitter. And although he covered a lot of ground and water, he remained in that same relative vicinity of the release site for the whole time. However, alligators are known to have a strong homing instinct, and many of the gators we've tracked since then have attempted to return to their established territories. Some have even, unfortunately, died trying. The second telemetry project is aimed at identifying high-quality nesting habitat on state-owned lands that would benefit most from sanctuary designation. So by protecting these areas, we would in turn be protecting some of those reproductive age females that are supporting our alligator populations. And these females have surprisingly small home ranges compared to males, and their activity patterns are centered around nesting and nursery habitats for most of the year. So because we're at the very northern extent of alligator range here, the population densities are much lower, and it's expected that our populations here are very close to stable or slightly increasing. So as I've mentioned, the loss of even just a few mature females could result in population declines that could take a lot of time to reverse potentially. So of course, as we locate nests, we are trying to learn as much as we can about nest success rates, hatch rates, survival rates, all some extremely important population vital rate information. Both females and nests have can be very hard to find, and we've been lucky to locate 1 or 2 nests a year on our state-owned lands. Unfortunately, there are more out there, but they're just very well hidden and even more difficult to access. So the aerial surveys that they use to count nests in other states really can't be used in most of our habitats here. They would be too obscured by tree canopies and shrubby vegetation. But this year, we're going to be employing some drone technology to try and locate nests in a couple of our marshier sites that have few or no trees where we've observed hatchlings in previous years. And then some of the best data, the most valuable data that we can get is tagging hatchlings and juveniles of known age. And this is because it's currently the only way to definitively age a live alligator. By marking it when it's young enough so that you know how old it is, so that when you catch it again, you'll know exactly how old it is at that point. It's getting pretty close to the end of my presentation. I noticed that we're
Yeah, it's okay. I think we're going to go a few minutes over. Thanks everyone for coming. If you have to go, we won't hold it against you if you leave. But I think we can take some questions and finish up for sure. Is that a nest in the picture? Yeah.
This is, yes. So this was a nest that a lady I had been down to look at a neighbor's alligator nest in her backyard, and in a previous year, and she'd watched me open it and count the eggs and everything, and was just chattering on about alligators and alligator biology. And she called me a couple years later, and she says, we were cleaning up this property across the street from our house that's on the lakeside, and this alligator was very upset and hissing at us. So I think there might be a nest nearby somewhere. Did you want to come look at it? And so I came down to look, and I said, well, here's the nest right here. She was like, that's a nest. She said, I thought it was kind of like right on the property line. And she thought that it was the neighbors next door had, just had a big pile of debris. And we went and talked to the neighbors, and the neighbors thought the same thing. They thought that it was a pile of debris that the other folks had.
Even though she had seen an alligator nest before, she didn't recognize it. It doesn't
Yes.
look like anything.
Yeah, so it's really, it can be difficult for people to know that that's what that is. And if she hadn't called me, it probably would have been hauled off by, some landscapers. So kind of interesting. There's just some pictures that we got on the nest. We're able to see how often the female comes and attends the nest, and also how often other critters come by. Thankfully, this raccoon didn't dig down into it, but that's one of the benefits of putting a camera trap on a nest, as opposed to me going and checking it every week. Every time you go, you're leaving a scent trail that can be followed by raccoons or other nest predators. And that's the last thing I'll talk about. We last year started spotlight surveys. We do 20 routes now, 2 in each of those 10 Alligator Management Unit 1 counties. And it requires 2 to 3 staff to scout for one day and then do 2 nighttime surveys. And what this will do will help us start building some trend lines so that we can kind of just keep a pulse on the local populations. So we won't be able to estimate how many alligators there are. We won't be able to extrapolate that data. But what's really useful is if there were any local population declines, for example, this would be something that would help us detect that. So we could go in and do some additional surveys if needed and try and get at what's going on there, that sort of thing. Yeah, I hope you guys have some questions for me.
We were wondering what happens if a nest isn't opened by the mother, because you mentioned earlier that the maternal instinct is to help the babies get out.
They can smother in the nest, so they may not be able to get out, but it's not a guarantee that they won't be able to. They can get out of the nest, but they're going to be much more successful if she's around. Some of these nests that I've dug into, you'd be surprised how tightly packed they are, especially from the rain and things. It really, I can imagine for a newly hatched little gator, it's got to be hard to get out.
And you were talking about earlier the difference between the male and the female bellows, and you can see the difference in the water, but can you hear the difference at all, or is it totally outside of our range of hearing?
It's a sub-audible bellow, so it creates the vibrations that the other alligators can feel, but we can't hear that necessarily. I did just recently, last week actually, go to put a couple of acoustic recorders out at the North Carolina Zoo so we can get some of our own recordings and try and do similar to what those researchers did, with the hopes that, if we can build an algorithm to help us make that type of determination of is it a male or female and what size the animals are, we could potentially do population studies without, passive population studies without, having an impact on the alligator's presence by the researcher being there.
Yet another way new technology is being used in this research. That's really cool.
Yeah. But they tell me they're at the zoo that sometimes they can like feel the alligator bellow like before it bellows. So it's not completely imperceptible, but you shouldn't, it's supposed to be subaudible. So at a low enough frequency that we can't hear it.
Yeah, it seems like all in all, this species seems like the most difficult to study of any in North Carolina. I can't imagine more obstacles from the animals themselves, or like you mentioned, how good they are at hiding. And it's just really impressive that you're able to gather any data at all.
It's a challenge for sure, but I do love a good challenge.
Yeah. I could probably stay on and ask questions about alligators for 2 more hours, but we are over time. So I wanted to thank everyone for coming, and thank you so much for sharing. We really appreciate it. We look forward to seeing you and probably in person at the next Reptile Amphibian Days.
Yes.
If you have any more questions, feel free to email us and we'll try to answer them. And I think that's it.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you guys. All right, we'll see you next time.
All right, take care.